नमस्कार मित्रों, आज हम एक नया अंक शुरू करने जा रहे हैं. फ्रेंड्स, वी आर स्टार्टिंग ए न्यू discussion in Kritya talk, that is ruminating poetry, and which is the idea of Sukrita Kumar and Vinita Agrawal. Both are both of them are good scholars and poets. We all know them. They are with me. Vinita, hello Vinita. Hello Sukrita Kumar. Hello. They will be running show. I am here just to introduce them, and we are going to present this program every month, first Saturday of the month. And this is very important for anyone who loves poetry and who likes to write good poetry. I just want to tell you, Sukrita and Vinita, that being a student of Sanskrit, our first introduction with poetics is like a Kavya Shastra from Bharat Muni from 2nd century onward. And then we see many scholars who talk about poetics, means how to write poetry, what are the important, what is the use of poetry, and all other things. And not only poetry, in that time, every thing, even the theater comes in the poetry. Kavya Shastra is talking about the theater also, theater art form and all other. I was studying for my book, then I find that even in Greek literature, even in a Persian literature, poetics is discussed a lot. And you know that both are scholars, so you know that this in English also, it was like that, or in Europe also. Even in China, it was told that why Confucius was popular and why the Tao was popular, because they always use poetry. And and not only that, somebody said that Mao's first interaction with the people was his poetry. So the poetry is very important voice which should be highlighted, but it should be discussed time to time, so that we can see that whether we are in right direction or not. That is why I feel that that's what I feel that we are here, because I this is your stage. I am just giving you introduction only about what I know. Second thing, I am very much happy that you people are working on it, because Dr. Ayappa Panikar, who has started Kritya, was working on the poetics. He was a English professor writing in Malayalam, but he was teaching his own students, who were the teachers at that time, the Bharat Muni's Kavya Shastra in English. And his idea was that even the English professor of India should know Indian kind of poetics, because they are writing in Indian English. And he was saying that we must bring a idea of rewriting poetics in modern time, and he has started a new idea, like that is a internalization of poetry. And he has written that book in Malayalam, which was translated into English, but which was not taught very well, because you know that critics sometimes it won't reach to critics, and it was only for the students and teachers. I do not know whether it is popular or not. If I get, I will give you the link and you people can read. In that book, he has taken each and every Malayalam poet and discussed about his poetry and different and how it was good or not. That so that is why I am very happy when you suggested this idea. I am thankful to you that Kritya is doing what our master has told us. So now this stage is yours. I am your audience, one of your audience. I am sitting down, and whenever you need, just give me message in private chat. I will come up. So Yeah. So, friends, I want to learn more about it. Thank you very much for this subject.
Thank you very much, Rati. I think this is fantastic that you have offered this platform to us, because not that we are scholars, but I think we are basically, yes, we have scholarly some pretension, but we are poets at heart. And both Vinita and I have been thinking about this, that while there is a lot of poetry happening, there isn't adequate rumination on poetry. And particularly in India, when suddenly one finds, even in the lockdown times and pandemic times as they are going on, there's plenty of poetry that is being written, plenty of poetry that is being also recited, and festivals are happening. A lot of it is happening around, but unfortunately, one big gap that we notice is that not adequate attention is being given to how to understand, how to appreciate poetry. Not that there is any formula for it. Of course, there is no formula for appreciation of poetry. However, we do know that while it may touch everyone or move people, but the point is that obviously the words start throbbing much more if there is a greater understanding of what's going on in the poem that one may be reading. My strong belief it is that all of us, each one of us, is a poet at heart, but unfortunately, the poet self gets particularly suppressed through the kind of education that we all have, which creates binaries and specializations. And also, if you're a medical student or a doctor or an engineer or an architect, you feel as though you have nothing to do with poetry. And yet, when you start reading poetry or listening to a poem, you say, oh, I'm touched and I'm moved. And something very tactical happens within, from within oneself. And that's why I like this expression that Rati used just now with reference to Ayappa Panikar when he said that, when I believe he talks about internalization of poetry. Well, the internalization has to happen for it to really touch us from within. And I'm so happy that we are going to start with this series, which doesn't mean that you will have to listen to Vinita and myself all the time ruminating on poetry. But we call this rumination of poetry or ruminating poetry primarily because we would want to invite a variety of poets from different languages, not necessarily English. It could be from different languages, but we'll try to keep our dialogues in English and Hindi for the wider dissemination of ideas. And there is not any one single way of looking at poetry. There isn't any one, as I said, no one formula works for anyone as to how to write poetry. Just as life cannot be framed or put into a box, or I honestly believe that similarly poetry also, a poem, when one is at it, it dictates its own terms of reference, it dictates its own form, but at least we have to know what form is in order to be able to recognize what is being dictated by the experience. But unfortunately, we are not taught to listen to that voice, that knocking that happens from within. Of course, many of us who've been writing for a very long time, we do hear that cut, that knock from in the subconscious. And when we hear that, sometimes we miss that out. But when we do hear it, one wants to quickly grab, whether it's a napkin or a tissue or if whatever paper that is available or a gadget that may be available. Phone these days works very well also. And one quickly wants to capture that image, which is an inspired image or an inspired line or an experience which has taken us, which is very rooted. And I want to emphasize on that particular word, rooted in experience, something that is rooted, which actually affects one, impacts one in a very significant way, and you feel compelled to give expression to it. Now, the next thing is that you need to have tools for that expression. But once you capture that little phrase or little image or a simile or a metaphor or whatever, then you may work on it much later. But that capturing is very important. And once you capture it and you sit down to write later, again, there are many tools that a poet has to use. For one, for instance, there is brevity, there is conciseness of a certain kind, simile, metaphor, a certain kind of punctuation, everything that goes into making the experience come alive. And that experience is not an exercise, it's not a riddle that one is creating. It is not as if, you deliberately build into the poem a certain kind of an ambiguity so that it becomes a kind of a riddle and people say, I know what it means. The other one might say, no, but it means this and not that. Now, that very fact proves the fact that this ambiguity is inherently built into a poem, if for no other reason but just this, that life itself is full of ambiguities. There is no one certain meaning of a poem. There is no certainty of meaning because there is the reader's mind also that operates in its own way and accepts and internalizes the experience of a poem from the point of view that comes from within that reader. And so there can be as many interpretations, as many meanings as there are the number of readers. So that is what is actually goes into what today's world calls postmodern relativity, a kind of relativity of truth. But that's not the point. The point is that it has to throb. And in that particular moment, when you're reading the poem, the passive poet, a passive reader becomes a passive, suddenly active and passive poet, and then recreates that particular experience, which is actually not just recreation. The poem is only a cue to build another experience over it, to basically those cues that are given. But naturally, sometimes what happens is you miss out on the cues, and sometimes your own meaning or mind starts working as a reader and you impose something else on the poem. I think the first important thing that one requires to do is to submit to the poem as it is written by the poet. But that a certain kind of a surrender has to happen. And when that surrender happens, then you begin to see how the poem, word for word, line after line, it begins to open up. And that particular key is what we are talking about. How do we catch hold of that key, which actually is going to open the poem for us? And that key has to come from within the poem. And then, of course, the interaction happens with your own, as a reader, your own mind or whatever. But the point is that the locks that the poet is making, they are not deliberately made out as locks, but it is just that the techniques and the tools that may have got used, or the words that may have been got into the poem, these words are obviously somewhere, in one sense, very subjective. Now, I'm going to tread very dangerous grounds when I say subjective, because actually all language is social. All language is meant for communication, which means that there are many minds that have gone into the making of language, any language. And therefore, language itself has an objectivity about it, the use of language. The fact that you are not writing a diary, but you are writing a poem, in that also there is a built-in notion of objectivity there. And we know what T.S. Eliot had to say about this. Something very personal becomes impersonal in the expression of a poem. And how? Because in the making of a poem, while it is getting communicated to the other, that mode of communication is taking the subjectivity away in a narrow way. And that subjectivity becomes objective, and the language in which it is getting captured is everybody's language. So if you find the right kind of words, the right kind of metaphors and similes, and not really make it a clever kind of an artifact, which is very clever in terms of the craft, but it is only language that begins to get shown off, as it were. But if it is carrying within itself certain kind of an experience, then the whole poem becomes a metaphor. The whole poem is a metaphor. There may be series of actually metaphors that you will discern here and there, but the poem itself becomes a metaphor of what you're trying to say. And it is that I think one has to unravel somewhere. It has to get unraveled by the other. And in that unraveling, there is a play that, one says, oh my God, this is transcending the normal. It is out of the box. It is creative. All these words are used. But what is this creativity all about? The inspiration is only the takeoff point. I always say that. And that takeoff point is very important. If one doesn't take off, then obviously no flights are possible, right? The taking off is very important, and the landing has to happen in the mind of the reader, as it were. But that journey is very important. In that journey, poetry is being, shall I say, cooked, brewed, or matured, and it starts blossoming slowly. And then when it becomes transcendental in one sense, because you're rising above the ground, as it were, but the feet have to remain in the experience. It has to be grounded, and yet you're taking off. This is a very strange kind of a paradox, as it were, in writing of poetry, or in the reading of poetry. But one of our points has been, Vinita and I have been talking about it, that while so much is being written and the appreciation is never talked about, that is why I think somewhere not just the younger generation, but I think all of us require a certain kind of intelligent communication or interaction about what poetry is all about. Of course, there are hundreds of definitions of what is a poem, what is poetry, and we know the much talked about, how poetry is a spontaneous overflow of emotion, and then slowly we say, recollected in tranquility. So everything comes into it. So if it is spontaneous, what is spontaneity in itself? We have to question that. That spontaneity is also built upon a series of experiences, series of points of view. And what seems like spontaneity is actually quite deliberate in the subconscious. However, that spontaneously comes into being, the words come. But there is something very interesting that happens, because it's also recollected in tranquility. There has to be in that movement a certain kind of, I believe, a stillness, absolute stillness. And in that stillness, there can be velocity. There can be an energy emanating from it. And another paradox then, that you have stillness and you have a lot going on. There's a lot of movement going on. There is internalization, but in that internalization, it's not a morbid indulgence in oneself. As you go deeper, you also realize that through that small being that one calls I, there is a collective I that exists within oneself. There is a collectivity of consciousness. And within that, one has to dip into it. And it's deep down into oneself. And from being B, small with a small b, you go into the uppercase being. And that is the journey from subjectivity to objectivity. And in that journey, the personal becomes impersonal. Impersonal in the sense that it reaches everyone. Otherwise, would I not, as a poet, be sitting in, not as a poet, but would I not be just writing my diary and not a poem? I can sit in my room and write my private thoughts, but the moment I want to write a poem, then it inevitably it acquires another edge to it, and a very significant edge to it. And that edge is that it goes into contact with the larger being that one is. And I always feel that poetry humanizes one. A- Any poem, a good poem, can change you forever. A good poem, when you read it with that care and read it with that attention, and that attentiveness is very important. Attention to every word, attention to the silence between two words, attention to the silence between two lines, the form of the poetry, the poem that you are reading, the form itself vibrates, it vibrates, the space around it vibrates. And how does it happen? Only if you are attentive enough, or I am attentive enough to realize what is happening. That realization is, I think, very crucial. And that can happen, it can happen, and then you become a poet yourself. Or if it doesn't happen, then no matter how much poetry you read all your life, one remains the same and you repeat yourself. There comes a point when you start repeating yourself. To be able to see the new in a trivial ordinariness of life, in triviality, that eye is required, that insight is required. There is sight and there is insight. And that insight, if one gets only if there is adequate, I would say, first attention, and secondly, the interiority that has to develop by taking off from that particular incident, or a character, or a certain image, or whatever that is inspiring one. And all the rest of it, then 99%, as Einstein had told us, had talked to us about it, is perspiration. Then you have to slog and work at it. And you might say it is spontaneous, but you might be doing inward editing. And therefore you say, oh my God, it's come spontaneously. But that depends on how much training of the mind there is, and how it takes shape on the page, and how do you take your editor's pen and you work at it in such a way that there is a certain kind of thrill of creation, and you feel almost like Columbus. But of course, you can make a mistake. You reach America and you think it is India. So that is a very crucial mistake, and these mistakes happen. And I remember this used to happen to me many a time, and I would be very thrilled as a young person. Oh, I've done this poem and it's so beautiful and all that. Or I would hide the poem under my pillow. So both these things happen. But sometimes I would take that poem to a reader, to a friend, to a good poet, and one could make out that it's not making sense. And then you feel, oh, you become snobbish about it sometimes, and you say, oh, this fellow can't understand. But no, you have to ruminate then and understand, and that somewhere you have gone wrong. So how do you correct your wrong? By knowledge. So somewhere there has to be an intellectual apprehension of the emotion, said somebody or the other, right? Similarly, there has to be an emotional apprehension of intellect. Both ways it has to work. And only then, when everything comes together, these binaries don't work. Emotion, this is emotional, this is intellectual. I think they have to come together. And in the coming together, the poem acquires a shape, and the shape of the poem actually starts dictating different meanings, layers of meanings. And that's the beauty of poetry. Whether one is a doctor or an engineer or architect or whatever, you will relate to it. You will relate to it. You might even become a poet yourself. There has to be an eclectic taste, and also there has to be aesthetics coming together with ethics, social justice. Those are the values that combine into aesthetics, and that's where it becomes even more aesthetically satisfying. Otherwise, if devils start writing poetry, it can only be clever poetry and not poetry really. So maybe Vinita, I would hand over the banner to you now to take on from here.
Sure. Thank you, Sukrita, for that wonderful, insightful, almost philosophical take on poetry and its craft and
Vinita,
its
one
meaning.
minute. Sorry, your voice is echoing and it is quite loud. Make it little low. Okay. Sorry for disturbance. Okay.
Not at
Uh,
all, not at all. Not at all. I'm not sure how to do that. Is there
keep
any way that I can do that?
keep keep distance from your
Just the
mic
volume.
because it is
Okay.
volume. You
All right.
uh, your mic's volume you can low
Oh,
it.
I see.
Uh,
Okay. Now, is that better? Is it
little
better?
more. No, you can do little more. Little slow. Slow.
Can you
Low.
hear me
Little
now?
low. No, you can. You are very over here. We can overhear you. So you
It's
Oh,
can
fine
little.
now.
can you
Okay,
help me
fine.
a
Now,
bit? I'll just
in
ask
fact,
my son to help because I have no idea how
no,
the volume.
no,
Can
it's
you reduce
okay. Fine.
my volume to
It's okay.
be reduced?
No, it's fine. Now, fine, fine, fine.
Right.
It's
Okay.
fine.
All right. Okay. Yeah. So I was in the process of thanking Sukrita for her wonderful philosophization of poetry and its relevance and its craft. And I'd also like to thank Rati for giving us this wonderful platform to present a whole series of ruminating poetry where we try to understand the craft and nuances of poetry. And since Sukrita has put into perspective why we need to understand poetry better, I think I'll just stick to the nitty gritty of this show and I'll just explain or maybe just guide you through how this is going to work amongst all of us. I had a lot of messages from poets and colleagues who were asking about this interesting concept that we've launched today. And a lot of them are interested in becoming also discerning readers of poetry. They're very good writers of poetry, but they also want to understand poetry as a genre, as a concept, as a particular poem. And here I would like to say that we need a lot of feedback from all our viewers and everybody who's watching this. You can tell us what would you like us to present in this? Would you like us to take a specific poem in one show in one session? And obviously we are the facilitators, Sukrita and I. And we will be talking to accomplished poets and eminent poetic personalities to so that they can throw light on the essence of a poem or a particular poem which you might want to understand better or you'd like it to be discussed. And here I'd also like to mention that we are not only going to focus on Indian English poetry, we may also take up poetry which has been written by other people, American English, British English, or even other poems, you know. So we would like all these inputs to come from you. Send us messages. You can send a message to Rati as well, or Sukrita or me, and tell us what you would really like this show to be all about. But as far as this inaugural discussion is concerned, I have listed out a few things that we would like to present to you during this show. As you know, it's titled Ruminating Poetry. So obviously, we're going to ruminate and discuss a poem or poetry in general. And poetry, as you all know, is compact language, right? So a poet has a lot to say, but it says it in the briefest of words. So if a poet is telling you many things in a compact language, then obviously you need to look at it very closely and you need to understand the finer aspects of that poem in order to grasp it better. So poets can converse with us as readers, and with even all of us as a society or as a collective. They can inspire you, as Sukrita mentioned as she was speaking about epiphany. One poem leads to another, something good that you've read leads to another, a beautiful, some creation from your side. So they can inspire you, they can heal you, they can agitate you, and they can obviously bring a sense of closure to grief sometimes. So poetry's canvas is and vast, and its impact is also different with different people. Each one responds to a particular piece differently. And here again, Sukrita had mentioned that every poem is open to interpretation. Once a poem is out there, floated into the open fields. It's everybody's property. They can respond to it the way they would like to. So when we discuss poetry, when we ruminate over poetry with our experts, it'll not be we will not be teaching it. We will be simply discussing it so that each of you can take back from it what appeals to you, what resonates with you. And I have listed down a few questions, so that just to sweep the flow of this session, in a sense, just to make things clear. Um, there's this whole debate about I in the poetry. Is it fair to always have your personal? But the personal is also universal. But that word I. So we can discuss that if you like, if you're all for it. And we will discuss the context of a poem. Supposing we take up a particular poem, why did the poet write it? What was he going through? There are so many poems of fairs that are extremely contextual. We need to understand the context to enjoy that. And in fact, I have a few, but let me not go into too many details. So we can look at the form, of course. We can look at it like a free. Is it a free verse? Is it a haiku? Is it a tanka? What is it? And while I was talking about this, is it confessional? Does it examine personal memories, personal experiences? What does the title do for the poem? How do we title our poems better? What are those great tips that help us to? Because the title can make or break a poem. It takes the poem forward. So, what are all the inputs about the title of a poem? How important is repetition in a poem? What does repetition do? The resonance of one, the cadence, and there are these famous 6 S's: syntax, space, speed. All those things can also be looked at. Those are the technicalities, but I'm sure some of our guests would like to talk about that as well. Is it a long poem? Is it an epic poem? And we will also discuss not only, I think we're going to try to, and I would like Sukrita to also comment here that mostly we're looking at contemporary poetry. We will not, possibly not take up too much of classical poetry. What do you think, Sukrita? Does that sound good to you to discuss contemporary poetry? Can't hear you. You've muted yourself.
Is this okay now?
Yes.
Okay, so I think it should not be it would not be a bad idea to also leave it to the speaker and try and see if there is a difference in between contemporary poetry and what was classical or what is classical, and in the context of that, if there is a discussion, I think we will be open to that, isn't it? One can
Okay,
take
let's
on
leave all
classical
the
in a
doors and
context.
windows. Yes, we can leave all the doors and windows open and we'll see how this
Yes.
evolves. Because,
Absolutely.
yes, because even this, does the poem belong to a particular period or a literary movement like the beat poetry or the Renaissance or the civil rights era or the feminist poetry, the genre, the different genres of poetry? Um, Things like, is it a narrative poem? Is it a lyric poem? How do we distinguish between the two? So, does the poet place significant information or emotion in these places? How does he use language? How does he use his words? Is there um, is the poem, abiding by all the rules that are normally in our mind regarding
Your
poetry?
voice.
Whereas, am I not audible? Am I audible? Okay, and we can also look at things like the last line of a poem. How does the poem conclude? All poets, I think, struggle with that epic last line. They always want to come up with the best they can. Does that last line really is it really needed, or can a poem gently end also? And just to make this not very dry and just not to bore you all too much, maybe I can just read a couple of poems that are examples of a very good craft, very, very well crafted poems. So And please feel free to comment and give us your feedback and your suggestions. I wanted to read Caged Bird by Maya Angelou, the very, very famous poem. And then I'll go on to a few other points as well. A free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till the current ends and dips his wing in the orange sun rays and dares to claim the sky. But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown, but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. The free bird thinks of another breeze, and the trade winds soft through the sighing trees, and the fat worms waiting on a dawn bright lawn, and he names the sky his own. But a caged bird stands on the graves of dreams, his shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. So, 2, 3 points here. I was talking about repetition. Maya Angelou repeats the first and the last stanzas. She does that for effect, she does that for emphasis, and to make it more and more emphatic. Also, this is a kind of a rhyming poem, and we will obviously there's more free verse in today's world. More free verse, yes, more free verse than rhymes, but yet um, the rhyme cannot be completely ignored, as this poem shows. It's very simple. The language used is extremely simple, and the craft lies in the flow of thoughts, if you notice very carefully. So, as I said, I'm the facilitator here. I don't want to offer too many expert-like comments, but I think we leave that to the guests, uh, who will be a part of the session in February, the first Saturday of February. And we want this to be basically a learning experience for all of you, everybody who's viewing it, for all our friends and colleagues who are viewing this. We would like it to be a learning experience for you, so that you can take home something that you can apply to your own craft of writing poetry and reading poetry, of course. And we will unpack poems for cadence and lyrical value and quality, and that will be the endeavor that we will strive to give you. Um,
Vinita, her connection has lost. Sukrita's
oh,
connection has lost. So
oh,
by that, I think she will take time. I have sent her a link. So by then
okay.
you can keep speaking and keep talking.
All
And I
right.
will. Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. So now I'd like to read a poem by Mary Oliver, whom many people admire her poetry. It's very real and sensitive poetry, I would say. Um, so I was talking about the context of a poem. Why does a poet write a particular piece? What happened in the poet's life for that piece to evolve and come out? So there's a poem by Mary Oliver. It's called The Black Walnut Tree, I think. One second. All right. So what had happened was Mary Oliver she and her mother were living in the same house, and they were running short of funds, and they were kind of bankrupt. And they considered selling off their black walnut tree, which was growing in their yard. And they kept debating on it, and trying to decide whether they should actually, because they loved it, they loved their tree, and they didn't want to sell it, but they might have to sell it for necessity. So this poem is about that, and I'll take you through the poem. So when you know the context, the poem becomes more enriched. My mother and I debate we could sell the black walnut tree to the lumberman and pay off the mortgage. Likely, some storm anyway will churn down its dark boughs, smashing the house. We talk slowly, two women trying in a difficult time to be wise. Roots in the cellar drains, I say, and she replies that the leaves are getting heavier every year and the fruit harder to gather anyway. But something brighter than money moves in our blood, an edge sharp and quick as a trowel that wants us to dig and sow. So we talk, but we don't do anything. That night I dream of my fathers out of Bohemia filling the blue fields of fresh and generous Ohio with leaves and vines and orchards. What my mother and I both know is that we'd crawl with shame in the emptiness we'd made in our own and father's backyard. So the black walnut tree swings through another year of sun and leaping wings, of leaves and bounding fruit, and month after month. Just one second. I think I've lost the. Give me a minute, please. Yes. So the black walnut tree swings through another year of sun and leaping winds, of leaves and bounding fruit, and month after month, the whip crack of the mortgage. The whip crack of the mortgage. So there you have it. Very simple poem, very simply conveyed, but in the power of the words lies the debate and the flux that they're going through on, whether they would like to sell the tree or not. And they try to list its demerits, the demerits of having that tree. Obviously, I'm simplifying everything. I'm just trying to give you a hint of what's to come. Our guests will give you a better ride, I'm sure. But I just wanted to share a few poems with this so that this doesn't become too dry, a kind of a talk. Do we have any questions? Because we're waiting for Sukrita to join us. If you have any questions, please do send them and we'll address them. But we would love to have your feedback and your inputs as to how this show should evolve. What can we do? What would you be interested in? Is there any particular poem that can you read and explain a contemporary poet? Okay, we would like to look at it as anybody writing in the post-colonial era as a contemporary poet.
Uh, Sukrita is in Himalaya, you know that, and I think she has some internet problem. She's trying her best to enter in. I think
Yes.
some problem from her side. Um,
Sukrita,
uh, uh, uh,
heavy
so,
rainfall
uh,
there,
uh,
indeed. And
uh,
she's, I'm glad she could join us for whatever time she
yeah,
did.
uh,
And I hope she can come back. But meanwhile, I would love to field more questions if you have any. And if you have any suggestions of particular poems that you would like us to discuss, or any particular aspect of the craft of poetry. Editing is a very important stage of finishing a poem. So one has to be brutal with that. Edit out all the excess words, and when you edit out your own words, it pains you because you've written it and you think it fits so well and it's such a beautiful word that you chose. But ultimately, you have to give it a very clinical look through, a very detached,
uh,
a very
in
detached look.
In Hindi also, we have to be very, very cruel to edit our own poem and
Correct.
very mild to use the words. In Hindi
Yes,
also, we have to
yes.
do that.
Well
and
said, Rati. Yeah.
and even
So,
translation also, when you translate, I have to make 3, 4, 5 drafts because I have to make it very crisp, and then I have to
yeah,
delete many things what I have written in
absolutely.
the language. Yeah. We
Very
are
true.
waiting for
Yes,
Sukrita. Mm, mm,
yes,
mm.
we are waiting for
But
her, but
you
it
can,
is
but you keep keep talking. I think, and it's very important. You what you are doing. I am very happy that the way Sukrita has kept the subject. keen and you have taken it. And I feel that these sessions will be very, very important for budding poets, not only budding poets, the poets like me also. So you please go ahead. These are the technical problems. She is near Himalaya. So you please go ahead.
Well, Rati, as you know that we will, this program is going to be with your technical support, and we're very grateful to you for providing us this platform. And without the relay of this program, nothing could be achieved. So thank you very much for hosting the whole show on the platform of Kritya, which is a beautiful platform, lovely space.
Kritya is only for poetry. So, and I'm happy that you came here. You have chosen us. So I'm very, very happy.
It's our pleasure.
My idea is that what you talk, I could understand till now. Well, my question is there that sometime you have to learn the poetry or you have to understand poetry along with the time and space. For example, we know that some famous poets, we know that, and we have learned about their background by the by because in a course and all we have learned about their background, so we can understand. But sometime, suppose I am reading a Chinese poet, or sometime I am reading that also in translation. So that time understanding poetry, because as a translator I feel that becoming very, very difficult. At that time I needed help from the poet. For example, I say that I had to translate from a Norwegian poet who was writing about the uh, nature. And nature in Norwegian is very different from the nature in India, and especially from the place I live. So then it was many shades, many different ideas on those poem was not open to me, and I had to write to him, Helge Torvind. I had to. He was a fantastic poet, and I had to write to him that please explain. And then he was sending me the photo along with the explanation.
Yes.
And it was
So you got
fantastic. So, so when he
you're
sent the
right.
photo, then only I could understand what it means, that where how these this flowers grow under the water, and how the light changes in a different
Right.
shades in a pond,
Yeah.
which was not possible in my place.
Of course. Of
So,
course. Yeah, so I
so
think that's a very important point because you've touched on this whole subject of translations, and we definitely
mhm,
would like to discuss translations
mhm,
because translations is what makes poetry transcend its borders. And
mhm,
I think poetry really needs to travel from one society to another. So we will definitely look at translations, and you're right about these multiple drafts that are needed. And a lot of research is needed when writing a poem as well as when translating a poem. So if the poet is say not available, if he's somebody, if you're doing it posthumously, then one needs to research well to understand what the poet tried to say. And you got photographs from the Norwegian poet.
mhm.
Um, so I think that you got your context in a way, right?
It was fantastic. It was fantastic.
And
And he told me that, do you have those discussions? I didn't save them. And they said that we
mm,
could print a book on it, because his poem in explanation and photos. So
yeah,
it could be a book form. But that is
absolutely.
that
Yeah.
also a way to understand a poetry.
Mm,
So, and because in this stage, what I'm thinking that English, of course, English poets we will invite, and sometime in Hindi poet also one or two.
sure,
But I feel that many good poetry I read in a translation, word poetry, we can take them also. Though the
definitely.
translated poetry is not very original, but sometimes translated poetry is also important, because how can we discuss about those poetry? So,
Absolutely. And
so
translation has its own set of craft. Translation
mhm,
has its own skills that are required, its own points that need to be considered. So we will definitely look at translations. And just coming back to this initial point I was making about being brutal with the editing, it is said that Dom Moraes used to edit his he used to have 60 to 70 drafts of one poem at sometimes. So how many of us really do that? So are we being brutal enough with our work for the sheer need of the poem, so that the poem stands out and becomes even further polished? So those are the important maybe tips that one may take away from our discussions later. I just wanted to sort of take you through the whole concept, like Sukrita did, and also point out some factual things like what are we going to look at when we look at a poem, when we ruminate a poem. Um, if you want, I can also read out one more poem by Adrian Rich, or maybe I should read out one by Pascal Petit.
Please.
Mm, this is a beautiful poem. It's titled Green Bee Eater, which is the name of a bird, actually. More precious than all the gems of Jaipur, the green bee eater. If you see one singing tree, 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 with his face black bill and rufous cap, his robes all shades of emerald, like treetops glimpsed from a plain, his blue cheeks black eye mask, and the delicate tailed streamer like a plume of smoke. You might dream of the forests that once clothed our flying planet, and perhaps his singing is a spell to call our forests back, tree by tree by tree. So you see how effectively she's played on the word tree, where in the beginning Pascal Petit is a wonderful eco poet from Britain, and she uses tree as a sound which the bird makes, tree, 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 and then she uses tree in its original meaning. And it's a very simply worded poem, but there are certain phrases that lift this poem up to another level, things like flying planet, right? And also, I wanted to show you this. We can also discuss shape poems. This is by Meena Kandasamy. I don't know if this is reflecting. Can you see this? It's in the shape of number
Uh, uh,
7.
no, you can't see that because it's only light is coming. So the photo is not coming.
I'm sorry about that, but this is a poem by Meena Kandasamy in her typical rebellious style. And
Yeah, she is very important poet. Yeah.
yes, and she talks about she's very powerful poetry, and her voice is a voice of resistance in these tumultuous times. So she's written this poem in the shape of number 7, where she discusses 7 rules that we might follow. This is her advice regarding love. So those are various things that can be discussed, and I'm wondering if Sukrita can join us back. Um, we would love to discuss Indian poets with you and some very, very well-known Indian poetry and Indian poets. But but I think I want to underline one thing, that the poem will always be bigger than the poet. In our show, it'll be about the poem, not that much about the poet. And we would like to really understand the nuances of that poem that we are discussing. The fact that it came from the poet, this particular poet, whoever it is just an additional wonderful information to be shared. But the focus will be on the poem per se. Maybe I can also read a poem by Adrian Rich. It's called Diving into the Wreck. Now, this poem is interesting because it is a confessional poem, but the title tells you, uses the word wreck, but it doesn't speak about it in the poem itself. So it's a very nuanced poem. At the same time, it's fairly easy to receive. The thing I came for, the wreck, and not the story of the wreck. The thing itself, and not the myth, the drowned face always staring towards the sun. The evidence of damage worn by salt, and sway into this threadbare beauty the ribs of the disaster curving their assertion among the tentative haunters. This is the place. And I'm here, the mermaid whose dark hair streams black. The merman is his armored body. We circle silently about the wreck. We dive into the hold. I am she, I am he, whose drowned face sleeps with open eyes, whose breasts still bear the stress, whose silver, copper, vermeil cargo lies obscurely inside barrels half wedged and left to rot. We are the half destroyed instruments that once held to a course the water eaten log, the fouled compass. We are, I am, you are, by cowardice or courage, the one who find our way back to the scene, carrying a knife, a camera, a book of myths in which our names do not appear. If you notice, the word wreck comes only in the title and once in the poem. And I think all of you must have understood what this poem is about. Would you like to write in your comments what she's talking about? What wreck is she exploring? Would you like to tell me? Or would you like to share with me? So, this is basically she's gone down deep sea diving to check out the wreckage of a ship. Who knows? It may be the Titanic. We don't know. It's not that specific, but we can assess and maybe assume a few things when you read a poem. So I think we've almost sort of reached the end of our session, but we would be. Oh, I see. Sukrita cannot come. That's very sad. If you have anything to say, we'd be happy to address it.
It was the first issue and very wonderful. I'm very happy that you both have taken very nicely and very important. And I'm sure that because what I feel that whatever work we do, it will be useful anytime because it is in YouTube also.
Good.
So YouTube and it's a channel, no? Kritya Talk Shows channel. So it
Yes.
will be YouTube. Automatically, it has gone to YouTube. And Facebook, of course, they don't save it, but we have recording also.
Yeah.
These things can be used afterward if teachers want. They can take it from us for their students. It
Yes.
is a good discussion when they teach in a classroom. Uh, oh God, internet is a fantastic. So now only I am left. Vinita is also gone. Uh, I feel that I'm telling you, please, we are keeping it in our YouTube and we are taking out our this video also. So this will be for the students, for their future, for their classrooms, where teachers can use them. And I'm I'm sure that they are giving very good ideas and this is the first issue because they got the internet problem and they got many other problems. So this is the first issue, and that is how there are some technical problems also. But these
Sorry, Rati, even
the,
I disappeared.
I know
I'm so
that that's
sorry.
what I'm telling what is happening.
Yeah.
Uh,
But
so
I think
but
all the teething troubles are from our side. Your
uh,
technical
uh,
stuff is all in place. You've been a wonderful platform provider to so many of us.
it
And I think,
technology we cannot say anything because it. But
yeah, I
my
think
side,
these will be
because
addressed as we go along.
but it is what I was telling our audience
Yeah.
that it will be in our YouTube and we have started. This is the only first introduction of our program. Yeah, she has also come. Wow. I think she is. Wow, welcome, madam.
Yeah.
Oh, there's
I'm so
Sukrita.
surprised. I think something went wrong.
Thank God you're back.
I'm really happy. So I
I'm
just
so
want to
sorry
say
to have
no, one
I'm so
sentence
sorry
only.
to have missed it all, but
No, it is in YouTube,
I guess
Sukrita. It will be in YouTube,
okay.
and
Okay.
I will download all this whole video, and it will be there. If anyone want, we can give them video also. It was very fantastic starting and fantastic. She
Yeah.
has explained very well. Now
Yeah. I
you
don't know
both
for how
can
long I'll be there. Is
conclude
the
it and
program
whatever.
still on?
Yeah, you can do because you were not there, so at least you can run at least 10 minutes more. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. So So, Vinita, I guess you have gone into the nitty-gritty as well as other information that we needed to get
Yes,
across. But I'm
I
very
think so.
glad that we have, at least in this inaugural program, we have spelt out what we intend to do, and it's a collective. It is only we are only going to be facilitators, and we just hope that there'll be more and more ideas, and we will be able to do a variety of kinds of programs in terms of working out not just definitions of what poetry is, not just writing poetry. Who are we to just teach anyone? It's not a question of teaching how to write, nor is it to be seen as a workshop, but it is collectively engaging with the idea of how to read a poem, for instance, How does one read a poem? Or how does one ruminate, basically, on the poem? And there are endless number of ideas that have already come in the form of books by lots of poets who have been writing on the creative process that one undertakes when one writes poetry. But how does one receive it? And in the context of reception, I think we have to also work out, as Rati put it very rightly, in the context of that, we need to work out how in various languages there are various kinds of poetics that have been worked out. And we have to see how there is an interlinguistic, interliterary movement also that happens. For instance, I was thinking, Aga Shahid Ali wrote ghazals in English. So obviously, the fact that he was grounded in Urdu and his knowledge of that Urdu language and Urdu shairi and Urdu ghazal was transported into English. And today there are many young poets and otherwise also you see poets writing ghazals in English. Similarly, Kabir ke jo dohe hain, for instance, doha form, which is like a couplet, but unique unto itself, that also has been transported. So it just depends on what kind of cross fertilization of ideas happen. And that is the kind of doors that we need to open for ourselves so that we receive more and more. And the distillation happens then from within oneself. And in that process of distillation, somewhere we cull out our own uniqueness in terms of expression. And in that
Yes,
uniqueness, a new poetry happens then. It happens. Every new poem is a happening. And that happening needs to be discerned. That happening needs to have an auditory sense also. You see it, you also want to listen to it, even if you don't, your own poem. When you write a poem, you also want to listen to it from within. It's an internal auditory sense that one has, which builds into the poem a certain kind of a rhythm. And it is, I think, this rhythm that we need to capture. Every poem has its own rhythm, even if there is no rhyme scheme apparently
I have two
that
things
is
to
being
say here.
used.
First is
But
that
that
yes,
rhythm
Sukrita,
is such a universe. So,
our canvas is really vast, and we have a
yeah.
broad horizon
So,
before us, and it's up to us to cull out whatever is
yes,
best for our viewers and our friends and colleagues and
absolutely.
poets. Secondly, Jayashree
Yeah.
Tripathi
And
has messaged saying that she was, I think she was wanting us to talk about the relevance of poetry, I think in contemporary times, something like that. I didn't see the whole message because it was on Twitter. But yes, I think we will also address certain these very essential questions of the relevance of poetry and how can poetry actually culminate in action. How effective is poetry in sensitizing us to various issues? So all this
Yes.
can be taken up in a broad, under a broad category of really understanding poetry and discussing poetry the best, so that that poem that is being discussed is completely absorbed by the person reading it, and we of course will only be helping you to do that, just
Yes.
um,
And
through
Vinita,
our
I think
readers.
when you started to speak, you did talk about this a little bit, whether it is in the context of healing or it is sometimes just sheer expression or self realization. But there's
Right.
so many things, you know. So I think we just have to keep ourselves, our minds open for
Yes,
actual action that takes
absolutely, I
place
agree
on
with
self.
that.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
And of course, we will
And
welcome all kinds of suggestions.
I think that is
And
really
we
going to
will
be
then
our
be.
compass, how what everybody wants to take away
Yes,
from this
yes,
discussion.
Sukrita has read
absolutely.
my book about the poetry therapy. So that is one way
Yes,
to read,
yes,
to
yes,
write
Rati,
poetry.
yes, yes, Rati. I think you have done so much work. In fact, I love the idea that there is a Kritya poetry movement. And I think this poetry movement is very inclusive. It's not only to do with the poetry within our own country, but poetry in general from any part of the world, from
Poetry in
Timbuktu to
film also.
wherever.
Poetry film, poetry
Yeah,
painting, poetry
Yes,
theater,
yes,
everything
yes.
is there. Uh,
You know,
ruminating poetry
Rati, I
broadly.
was so
Yes.
thrilled. I was so thrilled when Sonnet Mondal, for instance, had written a series of poems on my paintings.
yeah,
And it was lovely to see how paintings and poetry came together. And
yeah.
That's
I began
wonderful.
to understand my paintings better through his poetry, you know. So there were
You
lots
know
of
that
things.
That's such
when
an
we have
interesting thing.
started a Kritya first year, Ayappa Panikar was alive at that time, and he invited Kavalam Narayan Panikar. You know that he was the best theaterist
Yes, yes,
in
yes,
India. He invited him, and he presented his Bhasa Natak,
yes.
and that is Bhas is a very great poet and a
Yeah,
scholar
yeah,
in Sanskrit, and
yeah.
it was fantastic. Then some other party came with him, which presented Amrita's poetry in a presentation. And then B.D. Dattan, who is the one of the topmost poet, like Hussain, when Ayappa Panikar was reading the poetry, he was painting. And within five
Yes.
minutes, he painted. So the people who were watching him from the distance, they were saying that, is it is it like that somebody is writing poetry with the colors? And
Lovely,
in five ten
lovely.
minutes, he was a fantastic artist. But
Yes,
we
yes.
have another, because everyone cannot do that. But
Yeah.
so Kritya is lucky to get such fantastic
Mm.
people in our program.
Yes.
That's
So
wonderful. That is absolutely
Really nice.
wonderful.
Thank you very much for giving
Thank
us
uh,
the
you.
platform.
Thank
and
you all.
thank you,
Thank you.
both of you. You are taking your subject beautifully. And I am grateful
Thank
to
you.
you that you have chosen me and my Kritya. I'm not me, is I am servant of Kritya. I say that. Yeah,
We
and
are all
there are some
together. We
technical
are all
problem, but
together.
doesn't matter. She managed very well. I came in between to give her company.
Okay.
Thank you
No,
for
I'm so
that.
sorry there was a disruption of my
No,
network.
it is
I'm
not your
sitting in a
mistake because yeah,
Rati, I must
I'm,
tell you, I'm sitting in a monastery, which is a poem in itself. It's such
yeah,
a
beautiful.
beautiful place.
Yeah,
lucky you, Sukrita. Lucky you.
we will go
But I'm
once.
glad you could come back for a while at least.
Thank
We
you.
will go
Thank you.
once,
Thank you for
Vinita.
having
We
me.
will go with others also to this your
Yes,
monastery
for sure.
once.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, sure.
Okay, thank you,
So
Thank
we'll
you,
announce it
Vinita.
everyone.
Thank
soon,
you,
the next
Sukrita.
one.
It was
Thank you.
fantastic. I am grateful to you, and we will
Thank you.
continue
Thank
every
you.
month. Please keep it
Yes.
Thank
continue.
you,
Thank
Thank
you.
everyone.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Happy New Year to all of you.
A
Thank
very happy new year. A good start to the
Thank you.